I had always prided myself on being a man of reason, a modern priest in a world that seemed to need more common sense than blind faith. My parish, a small, isolated community nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside, had been my home for nearly a decade. The people here were simple, hard-working folk, but they clung to their traditions and superstitions like a lifeline. I often found myself as much a counselor and community leader as a spiritual guide, gently steering my flock away from their more irrational fears. Ghost stories and tales of curses were as common here as the church bells that rang every Sunday, but I had always dismissed them as the remnants of an older, more fearful time. The village, with its narrow streets and quaint cottages, seemed to exist in a bubble, untouched by the modern world. The fields that surrounded us were fertile and green, but they held an air of melancholy, as if the land itself carried the weight of the past. The people were kind, but there was always a hint of something darker in their eyes, a shadow that lingered when they spoke of the old ways. I had heard the whispers about witches and spirits, and while I respected their beliefs, I never allowed myself to indulge in them. My faith was rooted in the tangible, in the teachings of the Church and the solace of Scripture, not in the fanciful tales that seemed to haunt this place. It was during one of my routine visits to the parishioners that I first heard about Hannah Rayleigh. She was a bright, spirited teenager who had grown up in the village, but lately there had been talk of strange happenings at her family's home. At first, I dismissed it as typical small-town gossip. Teenagers often went through difficult phases, and in a place like this, where everyone knew everyone else's business, it was easy for stories to get blown out of proportion. But as the days passed, the murmurs grew louder, more insistent. People spoke of screams in the night, of objects moving on their own, of a darkness that had settled over the Rayleigh household. I decided to visit the Rayleighs, more out of a sense of duty than concern. In my mind, I was preparing to counsel a troubled family, perhaps a girl who had lost her way and needed guidance. As I walked up the gravel path to their house, I could feel the weight of the villagers' eyes on me, watching from behind lace curtains and half-open doors. The Rayleigh home was an unassuming place, a typical family house with a small garden out front and a picket fence that had seen better days. But as I approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with tension, and an unnatural silence hung over the place, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling. Mrs. Rayleigh greeted me at the door, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and her hands trembled as she led me inside. The house, once warm and welcoming, was now a place of shadows. The curtains were drawn tight, shutting out the daylight, and the air was stifling, heavy with the scent of decay. As we made our way to the living room, I noticed the broken mirrors and shattered picture frames that littered the floor, evidence of some unseen force that had torn through the home. My heart began to race, a cold knot of fear settling in my stomach. This was not the work of a troubled teenager. Something far more sinister was at play. When I finally saw Hannah, my heart nearly stopped. She was lying on the couch, her body contorted in a way that defied reason. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were now black pits of darkness, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. But it was the voice that truly shook me. A deep, guttural sound that did not belong to a 16-year-old girl echoed through the room, sending a chill down my spine. The words it spoke were in a language I did not understand, but the malice behind them was unmistakable. As I stood there, frozen in place, I could feel the air around me grow colder, as if the very essence of the house was being drained away. I tried to speak, to offer some words of comfort or a prayer, but my voice caught in my throat. I had faced many challenges in my time as a priest, but nothing had prepared me for this. My mind raced, searching for some logical explanation, but there was none to be found. This was beyond anything I had ever encountered, something that defied all reason and understanding. It was as if the darkness I had always dismissed had finally come to life, staring me in the face with cold, unyielding eyes. It was then that I knew I was in over my head. This was not something I could handle alone. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone and called the one place I had never imagined needing to contact: the Vatican. I spoke quickly, my words tumbling over each other as I described the horrors I had witnessed. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm, as if this was a call they received every day. They assured me help was on the way, but their words offered little comfort. I could feel the weight of what I had set in motion, a chain of events that I could no longer control. As I hung up the phone, I looked at Hannah again, at the girl who had once been full of life and now lay before me, a shell of her former self, possessed by something ancient and evil. I felt a deep, gnawing fear settle in my heart, a fear that I had only ever read about in the scriptures but never truly believed. My faith, once so strong and unwavering, began to waver. The world I had known, the orderly, rational world I had lived in for so long, was beginning to unravel, and in its place there was only darkness and chaos. I spent the rest of that night in a state of anxious anticipation, pacing the floor of my small rectory, unable to shake the image of Hannah's twisted form and the dark, guttural voice that had filled the Rayleigh's home. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old wooden floors, every rustle of the wind outside, sent my heart racing. I was not a man given to fear, but this was different. This was something that reached beyond the realm of the natural, into a place where my faith, my very understanding of the world, was being tested in ways I had never imagined. The Vatican team arrived just before dawn, their presence announced not by the quiet knock I had expected, but by the low, steady rumble of military vehicles pulling up to the church. I stepped outside, the early morning air biting at my skin, and was greeted by the sight of a convoy. Several black SUVs and a larger armored vehicle that seemed completely out of place in our peaceful little village. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, as if the very ground beneath us had become unsteady. Leading the group was a man who could only be described as imposing. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a face carved from stone, his features hardened by years of facing unimaginable horrors. His clerical collar was the only thing that marked him as a man of the cloth. Behind him followed another priest, younger and less assured, though his eyes held a haunted look that told me he had seen things that no man should ever witness. Flanking them were several Swiss guards, their uniforms concealed beneath black tactical gear, their faces hidden behind visors. These were not the ceremonial guards of St. Peter's Square. These were soldiers, armed and ready for battle. The older priest, whom I later learned was called Father Matthias, wasted no time. He approached me with a nod of acknowledgement, but there was no warmth in his eyes, no sign of the compassion I had always associated with the clergy. "Father," he said in a voice that was both commanding and calm, "we need to move quickly. Show us to the girl." As we made our way to the Rayleigh's house, I couldn't help but notice the efficiency with which the team moved. The younger priest, Father Gabriel, carried a heavy case of what I assumed were the tools of their trade, while the Swiss guards positioned themselves with military precision, ready for whatever horrors awaited them inside. It was clear that this was not their first encounter with something like this. The cold, clinical way in which they operated unsettled me, as if they were not dealing with a human life, but with something far less sacred. Inside the Rayleigh home, the air was thick with fear and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Father Matthias immediately took charge, opening the case Father Gabriel had brought. Inside were items I recognized from my own training: holy water, crucifixes, Bibles, but also objects that were foreign to me: ancient texts bound in leather, vials of unknown substances, and a dagger that looked as if it had been forged in another time, another world. I wanted to ask about these items, to understand what kind of battle we were about to face, but the look in Father Matthias's eyes told me now was not the time. The exorcism began with a solemn prayer, one I knew well, but there was an edge to Father Matthias's voice that made the familiar words seem strange and distant. He recited the rites with a precision that spoke of years of practice, his voice steady even as Hannah began to convulse on the couch, her body contorting in ways that should have been impossible. Father Gabriel stood by his side, holding the sacred texts, but his hands trembled ever so slightly, betraying the fear that I knew must be gnawing at him as it was at me. As the prayers intensified, so did Hannah's condition. Her voice, that deep, inhuman growl, echoed through the house, taunting and mocking us with words that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing colder with each passing moment, as if the very life was being sucked out of the room. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer and darker, until it felt as if we were standing on the edge of an abyss. And then, without warning, the room exploded into chaos. Hannah's body lifted from the couch, her limbs flailing wildly, as if she were a puppet on invisible strings. The crucifix that Father Gabriel held in front of her was ripped from his hand and shattered against the wall. The ancient texts flew open, pages tearing themselves from the bindings, swirling around us like a tornado of forgotten prayers. The Swiss guards moved in quickly, attempting to restrain Hannah, but it was like trying to hold down a force of nature. I watched in horror as one of them was thrown across the room, his body hitting the wall with a sickening thud. Father Matthias remained unfazed, his voice rising above the chaos, reciting the prayers with renewed vigor. But I could see it in his eyes. This was not going according to plan. The demon was stronger than they had anticipated, more malevolent, more powerful. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, the demon spoke directly to Father Matthias, revealing things about his past that no one should have known. Sins and secrets that cut through the older priest's steely demeanor, leaving him momentarily shaken. It was in that moment, as the exorcism teetered on the brink of failure, that Father Matthias made the decision that would change everything. "We have to take her to the Vatican," he said, his voice firm, but laced with something I hadn't expected. "Fear. We cannot contain this here. The ritual must be completed in the underground chambers." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The Vatican. The underground chambers. These were things I had only heard whispers of, rumors among the clergy that were never spoken of openly. And yet, here I was, being pulled into a world I had never wanted to know existed. The decision was made quickly. The Swiss guards, battered but still functioning with military precision, moved to secure Hannah. They'd bound her with thick, blessed chains, something that seemed more fitting for a medieval dungeon than a modern exorcism. I watched, helpless and horrified, as they carried her out of the house and into the armored vehicle waiting outside. As we drove through the village, I could feel the weight of what was happening. The villagers, who had watched in silence as the Vatican's convoy arrived, were now peering out from behind their curtains, their eyes wide with fear and suspicion. They knew something terrible was happening, something beyond their understanding, but none of them dared to come outside. It was as if the whole village was holding its breath, waiting for the darkness to pass. The journey to the Vatican felt like it took an eternity. Father Gabriel sat next to me, his face pale, his hands clenched around a rosary that he muttered prayers into, though I could tell his faith was as shaken as mine. Father Matthias sat across from us, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. No one spoke. The silence in the vehicle was heavy, broken only by the occasional groan or growl from Hannah, who was bound and gagged in the back, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. When we finally arrived at the Vatican, it was as if we had crossed into another world. The ancient walls loomed above us, their stones steeped in centuries of history and secrets. But it was not the grand halls of St. Peter's Basilica that awaited us. Instead, we were led through a series of tunnels, deep beneath the city, where the air grew colder and the walls closed in, the light from our torches barely piercing the gloom. The underground chambers were nothing like I had imagined. They were vast, labyrinthine, filled with the echoes of centuries-old rituals and the scent of burning incense. The walls were lined with ancient symbols, their meanings long forgotten by all but a few. This was a place of power, but also of unspeakable horror, a place where the line between good and evil was not just blurred, but obliterated. As we entered the chamber where the final exorcism would take place, I felt a deep, gnawing fear take hold of me. This was not just a battle for Hannah's soul. This was a battle for my own, and for the very essence of what I believed in. I had stepped into a world of darkness and chaos, and I was not sure if I would ever find my way back to the light. The chamber where we were led felt more like a tomb than a place of worship. The walls, made of rough-hewn stone, seemed to close in on us, their surfaces etched with symbols I could barely comprehend. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, and something else, something foul that made my stomach turn. The torches along the walls flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the floor. This was a place far removed from the grace and sanctity of the church I knew. It was a place where the ancient and the forbidden coexisted in uneasy truce. Father Matthias and Father Gabriel moved with practiced precision, setting up for the final exorcism. There was an urgency in their movements, a silent understanding that this was their last chance to contain the evil that had taken hold of Hannah. As I watched them work, I felt a profound sense of unease settle over me. This was not just a battle between good and evil. It was a confrontation with something far more ancient, something that defied the very fabric of the reality I had known all my life. Hannah was placed on a stone altar at the center of the chamber, her body bound with chains that glowed faintly in the dim light. Her eyes, still that unnatural black, followed us as we moved around her, but she made no sound. The quiet was unnerving, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted in the Rayleighs' home. It was as if the demon within her was waiting, biding its time, knowing that this was the final stage of a game it had been playing for far longer than any of us could understand. Father Matthias began the ritual with a prayer, his voice strong and steady, filling the chamber with the resonance of ancient words. Father Gabriel followed, holding the ancient texts and vials of holy water at the ready. I stood at the edge of the room, my heart pounding in my chest, feeling more like an observer than a participant in the events that were unfolding. But as the prayers intensified, so did the sense of dread that clung to me like a shroud. The demon within Hannah began to stir, its presence growing stronger with each passing moment. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, as if they were alive, responding to the dark energy that filled the chamber. And then, without warning, Hannah's body arched violently off the altar, her mouth opening in a silent scream that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the space around us. It was in that moment that the demon revealed itself fully. The air around us seemed to crackle with malevolence, and a voice that was not Hannah's echoed through the chamber, speaking in a language that sent a chill down my spine. It spoke directly to us, mocking our faith, our beliefs, our very existence. But it was what it said next that shook me to my core. The demon began to speak of things no human should know. Dark truths about the nature of existence, about the fragility of the world we thought we understood. It told us that the universe was not a place of order and light, but a chaotic and hostile void, where the forces of darkness were always waiting, just beneath the surface, to tear it all apart. It spoke of the Church's role not as a beacon of hope, but as a desperate, failing attempt to hold back the inevitable collapse of everything we held dear. Father Matthias pressed on, his voice rising above the demon's taunts, but I could see the strain in his eyes. The demon's words had struck a chord, revealing secrets that even he had not been prepared to face. Father Gabriel, too, looked shaken, his hands trembling as he held the holy water aloft, ready to cast it at any sign of the demon breaking free. But it was clear that this was no ordinary exorcism. This was a battle not just for Hannah's soul, but for the very essence of what we believed in. As the ritual continued, the demon toll on Hannah seemed to weaken, but it was not done yet. With a final, desperate effort, it turned its attention to me. I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my heart as the demon's voice filled my mind, whispering dark promises, offering me knowledge, power, a glimpse into the true nature of the universe. It told me that the church was a lie, that the faith I had devoted my life to was nothing more than a fragile illusion, a curtain hiding the chaos that lay just beyond. I fought to resist, to hold on to the faith that had been my guiding light for so many years. But the demon's words were insidious, worming their way into the deepest recesses of my mind. I could feel my resolve crumbling, my beliefs unraveling as the demon's truths took root. The room around me seemed to fade away, and I found myself standing on the edge of an abyss, staring into a darkness so profound that it seemed to swallow all light, all hope. But just as I felt myself slipping into that abyss, Father Matthias's voice cut through the darkness, strong and unyielding. He spoke words I did not understand, words of power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the chamber. The demon recoiled, its grip on my mind loosening as the light of the altar began to grow, pushing back the shadows, forcing the darkness to retreat. With a final, earth-shattering scream, the demon was expelled from Hannah's body, its presence sucked into a small, ornate vessel that Father Matthias had prepared. The air in the chamber seemed to crack and shatter as the demon's essence was contained, and for a moment, all was still. Hannah collapsed onto the altar, unconscious but alive, her body free from the twisted force that had taken hold of her. But the battle was far from over. As I stood there, trembling and shaken, I realized that the demon had not been defeated, only contained. The vessel that held it was taken by the Swiss guards, who moved with swift efficiency to secure it deep within the Vatican's vaults. Father Matthias, his face lined with exhaustion, turned to me and spoke words that would haunt me for the rest of my days. "This is not the end," he said, his voice low and grave. "There are many more like it, waiting in the darkness, and the barriers that hold them are weakening. We are not fighting to win, Father. We are fighting to delay the inevitable." As we left the chamber, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. The world I had known, the faith I had held so dear, had been shaken to its core. The demon's words echoed in my mind, a dark and terrifying truth that I could not unhear. The universe, it seemed, was not the orderly place I had believed it to be. It was a fragile construct, held together by nothing more than the desperate efforts of those who knew the truth, who fought in the shadows to keep the darkness at bay. And as we ascended from the depths of the Vatican, I knew that I would never be the same. The world above might continue on as it always had, the sun rising and setting, the people going about their lives, blissfully unaware of the horrors that lay beneath. But I had seen the abyss, and I knew that the light was not as strong as I had once believed. It was flickering, fragile, and one day it might just go out. We emerged from the Vatican's underground chambers in the cold light of dawn, but the sun did nothing to warm the chill that had settled deep in my bones. The world outside seemed unchanged, indifferent to the horrors that had transpired beneath its surface. St. Peter's Basilica loomed in the distance, its grand facade a stark contrast to the darkness I now knew lay hidden within the church's deepest recesses. The city was just waking up, the streets beginning to fill with the everyday bustle of life. But to me, it felt as though I had been transported to a different reality altogether, one where the boundaries between light and dark, good and evil, had been irrevocably blurred. Father Matthias was the first to speak as we exited the chamber. His voice was quiet, almost reverent, as he instructed the Swiss guards to take the vessel containing the demon to the vaults. His eyes, once so stern and assured, now held a weariness that I understood all too well. He had fought many battles in his lifetime, but this one had taken its toll. I could see it in the way he moved, each step heavy with the knowledge that our victory had been, at best, temporary. Hannah was taken to a nearby hospital, where she would receive the medical care she so desperately needed. I did not follow. My role in her ordeal had come to an end, and I could not bring myself to face her parents, to see the fear and confusion that would undoubtedly linger in their eyes. How could I explain to them what had happened? How could I, when I could barely comprehend it myself? They would be told something plausible, something that fit within the bounds of reason, but I knew the truth would haunt me for the rest of my days. Father Gabriel, still pale and shaken, offered to accompany me back to my parish. His eyes were filled with the same haunted look that had become all too familiar. We traveled in silence, the weight of the night's events pressing down on us like a heavy shroud. When we finally arrived, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I stepped out of the vehicle. My parish, once a place of comfort and routine, now seemed alien to me. The familiar church, with its worn pews and simple altar, felt like a relic of a world I no longer belonged to. The first thing I did was enter the church alone. The silence inside was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise that still echoed in my mind. I knelt at the altar, but the words of prayer would not come. My faith, which had been my anchor through so many storms, felt distant and hollow. I stared at the crucifix, searching for some sign, some reassurance that the horrors I had witnessed were not in vain. But all I found was emptiness. The church, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, a place that held only memories of a time when I believed the world was governed by a divine order. The days that followed were a blur of routine and numbness. I went through the motions of my duties, tending to my parishioners, leading services, offering counsel, but it all felt like an act. The village, too, seemed to sense that something had changed. People looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and unease, as if they could see the shadows that now clung to me. The whispers started almost immediately. Rumors of what had happened at the Rayleighs' home, tales of dark forces and Vatican secrets. I did nothing to quell them. How could I, when the truth was far worse than anything they could imagine? At night, I could not sleep. The demon's words haunted me, replaying over and over in my mind. The universe is not what you think it is, it had said. The church is not what you think it is. These thoughts gnawed at me, unraveling the carefully constructed beliefs that had sustained me for so long. I began to question everything. My faith, my purpose, the very nature of reality. I found myself drawn to the darkest corners of Scripture, to the apocryphal texts that spoke of chaos and the end of days. But even these offered little solace. They were just more pieces of a puzzle that no longer made sense. One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, I found myself descending into the church's basement. There, in a forgotten corner, was a small library of old, forbidden texts, books that had been hidden away for centuries, deemed too dangerous or heretical for the faithful to read. I pulled one from the shelf at random and began to read, the ancient pages crackling under my fingers. The words were dense and cryptic, filled with references to beings and forces beyond human comprehension, but they spoke to the darkness that had taken root in my soul. As I delved deeper into these forbidden texts, I began to piece together a terrible truth, one that the church had fought to keep hidden for millennia. The universe was not a place of order, governed by a benevolent creator, but a fragile construct, held together by a delicate balance that could be shattered at any moment. The church, with all its rituals and dogma, was not a bastion of light, but a fortress built to keep the darkness at bay, a darkness that was always waiting, just beyond the veil of reality. This realization nearly broke me. I had dedicated my life to the service of God, to the belief that I was part of a divine plan, but now that plan seemed like a cruel joke. I was not a shepherd guiding my flock to salvation, but a soldier in a war that could never be won, fighting against forces that were beyond my understanding, beyond my control. The church was not a sanctuary, but a battlefield, and I was just another pawn in a game that had been going on since the dawn of time. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed with these dark truths. I spent hours in the basement, poring over the ancient texts, searching for answers, for some way to reconcile the knowledge I had gained with the faith I had lost. But the more I read, the deeper I descended into despair. There were no answers, only more questions, more horrors waiting to be uncovered. The church had fought to keep these secrets hidden for a reason, and now I understood why. Some truths are too terrible to be known. Eventually, I realized that I could not continue down this path. The darkness was consuming me, pulling me further and further away from the light. I knew I had to make a choice, either embrace the abyss and lose myself completely, or find a way to hold on to the small, fragile flicker of faith that still remained within me. It was not an easy decision, but in the end, I chose to turn away from the darkness, to leave the ancient texts where they belonged, in the shadows. But even as I tried to reclaim my faith, to rebuild the shattered pieces of my belief, I knew that I would never be the same. The knowledge I had gained, the truths I had uncovered, could not be unlearned. The world above might continue on as it always had, but I had seen what lay beneath it, and that knowledge would haunt me for the rest of my days. Now, I continue my duties as a priest, but it is with a heavy heart and a weary soul. The light that once guided me is dim, flickering in the darkness, but it is still there, and I cling to it with all my strength. The world may be fragile, the universe may be chaotic, but as long as there is even a glimmer of hope, I will continue to fight. For what else can a man do when faced with the abyss, but hold on to whatever light he can find?